So my intention for today is to just have a great, fun conversation and raise awareness on some topics that are really important to me, like unconscious bias, and just really talk about issues that I think need more awareness that I'm passionate about. And I know you are too. So, because I've been following some of the stuff that you're out there posting about. So I have no doubt we're going to have a great conversation today.
Hey, it's Bobby. Welcome to Student of Intention, where we help you enjoy the pursuit of purpose. And remember, don't wait, start small, learn as you go. Hey there, friends. Welcome to Student of Intention. I'm your host, Bobby Dysart, here in the Creative Palace, getting ready to welcome my guest, Sejal Thakkar. This is the little corner of the internet where we spark, strengthen, and support self-discovery. It's just a wonderful afternoon, and I'm really eager to get going. So I'll get into the story, and then I'll welcome Sejal to the show. And the story is actually, it came to me during my run today, and I was thinking about the idea of familiarity as sort of a problem, and familiarity in the sense of like getting used to things or things sort of losing their luster. I even think about this podcast. I sort of caught myself, I don't know, I guess this was about a month ago, having these thoughts of like, oh, I got to go do a pod today. Oh, I got to go like make time for this. And sort of was like really funky because just, 8 or 9 months ago when I started this podcast, like you literally couldn't have thought of something like better for me to do. Like I was coming into the Creative Palace with insane amount of enthusiasm and excitement. And today I sort of thought about that. I thought about how that applies to a lot of things. It can apply to, our creative work like this podcast or writing or any sort of, business or job. It's kind of like that favorite song that you listen to time and time again, and then all of a sudden it's played out. And I thought about that concept, again, today on my run. I was like, well, does that make the song any less of a jam? Or is that sort of a you problem? You're sort of just not hearing the awesomeness anymore. And fortunately for this podcast, I've definitely gotten it back. I came in today feeling really excited, and I think about, that perception is really, really what it is, that perception that goes along with familiarity. And I thought about different ways to get it back. So, I want to kind of give this to you. If you're facing any sort of just lack of appreciation for something that you do a lot of, again, particularly around work, there's 3 things that I know I try to do, when it comes to writing or when it comes to podcasting, to help sort of rekindle that spirit, that savoring of the experience. So 1, I like to change my approach. Literally, I like to copy how somebody's doing something else. So with writing, I get really fascinated with how other people are writing, and I try to see if I can sort of try on their writing style for a week or 2. Change their environment. When it comes to just work, you'd be surprised. You work outside, you work at a coffee shop. I work at home, and just sometimes I just go in the living room, pull up my laptop. It's a totally different experience. Reminds me how much I actually savor the work I'm doing. And then the last one, go deeper. Explore kind of a weird or small part of your work. Like really get in there, dive deep. I always find that if I just dive down a rabbit hole of learning, it actually seeds curiosity. I think we think of curiosity as the other way around. But if you dive in deep down one thing, you'll be surprised how it changes the experience. So take that for what it's worth. I promise whatever you're doing, again, whether it's your work, whether it's creative pursuit, dare I say even a relationship, I promise the shine is still there. It's just up to you to figure out how to see it. And with that, I'll shift to my guest again. Her name is Sejal Thakkar. She's a chief culture officer at Nobody Studios. She's also the founder of Train Extra. I met Sejal through LinkedIn, my platform of choice, and we connected, I want to say 5 or 6 months ago. She's just a wonderful follower on there, always posting content. She's an attorney, an educator, an entrepreneur, and her work is rooted in her passion for civility, inclusivity, and acceptance. Real excited to welcome Sejal to Student of Intention. Sejal, welcome.
Thank you so much. Wow, that was a beautiful story and lessons that you shared already. So thank you. I was listening to you and I was like, wow, that's some really useful information. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate it. These things come to us when we're out and about. Again, I was just running out on the beach today and had that thought that I just wanted to keep following. And I think we can follow this into our conversation. When we talk about perception, familiarity, I can't help but think of bias. And I know bias is something that's really prevalent in your work. Mm-hmm. So why don't we talk, I kind of want to just know the latest with regards to bias in your work in general, because you're constantly on it. You're constantly progressing how bias affects the workplace. So why don't we open it up there?
Yeah. Well, as you know, I'm super passionate about it. It's been something this idea of bias has been something that I've been dealing with my whole life. And so, but now I'm blessed that I can incorporate not only my personal passion for raising awareness on it, but then I can combine it with the work that I'm doing, right? So I found that sweet spot now where it's like, yes, now I get to actually make a difference and impact people. But, I chose bias as the area that I want to really focus in on because as you know, I kind of I gave myself the name Chief Civility Officer, right? And so that really comes from having done my career as an attorney. I saw a lot of bad behavior, a lot of stuff going on, harassment, bullying, discrimination, that kind of stuff in the workplace. And I just saw, it just made me sick to my stomach when I'm like, there is something we can do to make better environments, and so figuring out which angle to go at it, because there's a lot of different angles to go at it, right? So, but my angle was that because that's where I can talk about my story. I can really bring in what I've gone through, both what I've seen professionally and personally to really impact people, right? So, yeah, but it's wonderful to be able to get here. And then also doing this podcast, having friends like you that support my work and invite me to share this so that we can really raise awareness on it. That's literally what I feel like I do as much as I can on this issues. Let's just keep talking about it. And if it impacts one person, mission accomplished, because we need everyone to really start doing this work. So thank you again for inviting me.
You got it. And I definitely want to jam on your story a little bit and hear about, A, your background, B, how you finally decided to bring your passion and your work together. That's always interesting for, I think, living an intention life, because so many of us want to do that. We just don't act upon that. Mm-hmm. But I want to hang on this thread a little bit. I think you actually wrote about it. I believe it's somewhere in your LinkedIn. You call it your magical key. Mm-hmm. And you call your magical key the ability to choose to see beauty in the differences, mm-hmm. Which again, I think relates just so much to what I was just talking about and what I kind of nerd out on all the time is the beauty in the differences, right? To be able to see that, because I think just so much and this is of course in the workplace, but really anywhere, we're just sort of blinded to all the beauty that's out there. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean when you say it's your magical key?
Yeah. And so, by the way, that comes from are you connected to Meg Nocero on LinkedIn?
Meg Nocero. I don't think so.
I have to introduce you to her because she'd be an awesome guest on your podcast, but she's an amazing woman anyway. But she has she just released a book called The Magical Guide to Bliss, and you will love it, Bobby. And so I love it. And so I was on her podcast a few weeks ago and she had me set my intention. And so she basically had me pick a number, and then she opened up her book to a page in her book. And on that page was this magical key. And it said, choose to see the beauty in your differences. So shout out to Meg. And so I told her on that episode, I said, hey, I'm going to put it on my LinkedIn profile. And so you're the first person that's asked me about it. So really cool. But the way that I interpret that, right, for me, and it's really, when I think about why we have the problems that we do right now, right? And I go for me, how do I see the root cause? It really is that, we live in this world where there is this kind of scarcity mindset. There's this fear that there's not enough for everyone to go around. And so we live in this environment where it's ingrained in our culture, in our values, and in just the way we're hardwired almost. Because it's like from the time that you're little, and it creates this kind of us versus them mentality, right? And so that divides us as people. And so when we say choose to see the differences, the beauty in differences, is that you have to expand your lens, the way that you view the world, to go outside of what you're comfortable with. Because we are, again, hardwired to feel comfortable around people that look like us, that talk like us. It's normal. But when you start to go and surround yourself with different demographics, diversity, not just representational diversity, but cognitive diversity, people that are different than you, that have different occupations than you, that have traveled, just people that are different than you, basically, right? Then you start to see there is such a beautiful part of people when you get to that level, right? And most people don't even get to experience it because there's just so closed off that they're not even willing to take that first step to open themselves up to take that action, right? And so, for example, I'm Indian. My parents came from India and I was born here. So at home, I dealt with the Indian culture. Outside the home, I dealt with the American culture. I've seen both, and I find beauty in both cultures, right? But if you haven't been exposed to the Indian culture the way I did, you might not see that beauty, right? But if you look around and you see, and you're like, I don't have any Indian friends, or there's nobody that I am connected to that's Indian, you have to be intentional to make that happen and say, I'm gonna try to make friends who are Indian, or I'm gonna talk to somebody who's done this or done that. So you have to be intentional about it. And so, but it is beautiful when you actually do that. I know you do that. I read your posts again, like I said, and when you start actually seeing that, you realize that you actually have more in common than those differences anyway, but those differences bring that uniqueness to each one of us, right? So
that's right. That's right. And one thing I really enjoy about, some of your TED Talks and some of your interviews and some of your posts, you definitely sort of, how do I say this? You kind of disarm the conversation a little bit by saying, hey, this is normal. Right? Like this happens to all of us. I think when we get into these conversations around bias, right, like they can quickly elevate to sort of a blame game of sorts and just increase judgment. But you actually do a good job of saying like, hey, like we all kind of deal with this on some way, on some level. Can you talk to me a little bit about like what you mean by that and that it's normal? Because I agree, I'm like, and I see it in all types of examples, right? Like I've been in Southern California for 13 years, and my folks and I was raised in Ohio. My folks live in Ohio, and like when I go back there just to eat, it's like we're on different planets when it comes to food. And it's because I've just been exposed to so much different cuisine here that it's really weird. It's sort of awkward when we try to relate on just choosing a restaurant, because they're just like, sort of scared of it, I think, of like just things like that I take for granted, like sushi or like, what have you. So I definitely sense it's normal, but I don't really know why. Can you share a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is the reason why I did do that TEDx talk, and I do like to talk about this topic a lot, because what I've learned is that a lot of people, bias, first of all, when we say the word bias, it could be conscious bias or unconscious bias, right? I think up until this point, we've been really focused in on how do we deal with conscious bias, like people who have conscious bias, who are engaging in acts of violence and hate, of prejudice, of racism, sexism. We're focusing all our efforts. We have been on that. But I don't think we've spent a lot talking about unconscious bias, right? Which is, so when I say bias is normal, I'm saying that we all have unconscious bias, and let's talk about that. Let's understand what it is. Let's understand that it's normal in that it's just the way that our brain functions, and it creates these shortcuts, which then we make judgments about people, right? And so it's a normal process. But the thing is, Bobby, is that we're all different from each other. And so those biases, those hidden, I call it hidden biases, right? Those unconscious biases that you have, they're hidden from you. So you don't know about them. And those stem from your own lived experiences. So you've lived in Southern California. I've lived in Northern California. I've got Indian parents. You've got different parents. You have different schools. So our hidden biases are going to be different from each other and from everybody else. And so really all of this is just boiling down to each one of us doing the inner work to understand our own hidden biases, whether they're positive or negative. They could be either, right? And so the thing you want to do, the sooner that you start doing that work, what you realize are things like, wow, these hidden biases are exactly the opposite of what I currently believe, right? But yet I'm acting in accordance to these hidden biases because I don't know about them. I'm not aware of them. So they're literally controlling my behavior, or I'm engaging in behaviors towards other people without even knowing it because I haven't done the work to understand them. And it's a lifelong process. It's like kind of like your student of intention, right? It is an ongoing journey. It's not like you could come to one of my training sessions and, yes, I'm a great trainer, but I can't tell you about all your biases in an hour. This is like lifelong work, but we want to keep educating people and raising that awareness because ultimately they have to do the work themselves. That's the only way it works.
That's 100% right. And I guess just for helpful context, and I 100% agree, like this is a never ending task for better, for worse, whatever kind of work that you have to do, particularly untangling perception, untangling, unconscious bias, like that's just, you're in for the long haul here. So let's give some context around like, what's the impact of these things? So, dare I say that we're all motivated to change. What are some impacts that you notice at an individual level, organization, community level that these unconscious biases cause?
It impacts in every single situation. Basically, every decision that we make every day on who we're going to interact with, who we're not going to interact with, who we're going to hire, who we're going to promote, who we're going to associate with, who we're going to socialize with. It impacts everything. The point is that if we don't do the work to understand your own hidden biases, then you're going to be engaging in certain behaviors that once you learn about it, it becomes conscious bias, right? And then you act according to that bias, which then can have either negative consequences, or it can result in you favoring some people because you have a positive bias towards them, right? So for example, my son, right? He is the center of my universe. I literally talk about him in every single podcast because my world revolves around him, right? So if I see someone looking like my son, I'm going to have a really favorable response to that person. So I have a positive bias towards that person. So for that person in that situation, that's a good thing. But that's not a good thing for the other people who don't look like my son, who may not get a fair shot because I've already identified favorably with this person. But there's nothing wrong with that. It makes sense. I'm his mother. Of course, I'm going to have well, if you like your kid, you're going to have a favorable bias, right? So, but it's about doing that work. So, but if it's a negative bias and if it's a hidden bias that you don't know about, it can then result in things like microaggressions, right? So now you're saying things or doing things. It could be the tone of your voice. It could be the way you look at somebody, whether you make eye contact with them, whether you interrupt them. It could be a number of different behaviors that you might engage with that person that are harmful to that person, but you're not intending to harm them. It's happening unconsciously. So that needs to be addressed head on because, again, as an attorney, what I saw was, here I was thinking, I'm going to be dealing with all these malicious people trying to hurt each other, when a reality of it was a lot of this behavior, had it been dealt with when it first started to happen, maybe as a microaggression, then we could have prevented that from escalating into turning into some sort of intentional discrimination or harassment. But because they got away with it and they continue to engage in those behaviors, and many do still today, right? It becomes normal. And so now we have to work even harder to make that not be normal and just kind of say, no, that's not normal. We're not going to tolerate those behaviors anymore. We're not going to tolerate incivility anymore. We're not going to take rude or unprofessional behavior at work because we're just not going to do that anymore. We're not going to fall into that us versus them mentality. And so the good news is it is happening. We are starting to see some positive changes, and I'm seeing more and more people speak up every day and start addressing these behaviors. And it's going to be a slow process. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, right? And so the more that people understand it, we hope the more that they change, at least at a very minimum. My goal is to raise awareness and have people start changing their behavior. They don't necessarily need to agree with every single thing I'm saying, but by changing behavior, we'll know that over time, they're going to change their beliefs as well, right? As they start seeing positive outcomes coming from changed behavior. So that's kind of the goal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when you talk about changing behaviors, changing belief systems, right? Like, I can't help but we talked a little bit about the news and trying to stay away from the news. If you look at the news, I don't think it's out of line to say like the world's in trouble. When we look at the news, I think the racial tension couldn't be higher. The political unrest couldn't be greater. The conscious and unconscious bias, like, couldn't just be more prevalent. I'm curious, as someone who takes this into the workplace, what your sort of read on things is. Are we making strides? Are we worse than we were 20 years ago? Are we better? Like, what's your sort of read on the workplace side of things compared to maybe what we see in the news with regards to these issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer that question because this last year and a half has really set us back in a lot of ways. And so we see like a decade of work done by gender equality going out the door, just here in the United States because of COVID and all the women that have left the workforce. So we're not talking about Afghanistan and everything else going everywhere else, right? So it's in that sense, we're seeing a lot of going backwards. We're taking a lot of steps back, but on other fronts, we're seeing a lot of forward movement too, right? And so again, the problem is it's not one solution. It's not one area. So it's not like we just have to deal with racism or we have to deal with a lot of different issues. And in a way, if you think about it, it's kind of normal, right? Because we weren't set up as a country for all of this diversity. So it's growing pains, like major pains, right? But it is, because now we have all kinds of diversity. And so that's why I take the approach that I do, is that let's think of diversity as that we are all different from each other, period, right? And so every organization, I mean, it doesn't matter about the representation, you still have people who have differences in the way that they think, their perspectives, their upbringings. You still have to address those issues, not just say, oh, just because they have the same skin color, they're all, the same. That's not the way it's going to work. And so we have to, if we're going to do this right, we have to go all the way to the basics, right? Which is that we are all different and we all need to be equipped. And we know that diversity is a good thing. Like, unless you've had your head in a cave for the last 400 years, right? Like, we know that that's pretty much a done deal. But the other part of it too is that we have to acknowledge, and this is where I fall into this category, is helping organizations acknowledge that there are challenges that come along with diversity. And again, diversity, we're all different from each other. So we have to acknowledge that, and then we have to put in the resources and the support to help the challenges that those specific diversity that you have within your walls is creating for your company. And so it has to be that sort of creating that plan. And unfortunately, how hard it is to do that for most organizations. If they've been going for 30 years, these things are ingrained in their culture. So it's going to take a lot of work and effort to get everybody on the same page on this issue.
Oh, it's it's bizarre how challenging it is. I'll give you an example. So one of my clients that I work with, a woman-owned business, predominantly women. I think the population of the company, it's about a 20-person company. And I think 85, maybe 90% are women, and a lot of white women at that. And they're, I help with recruiting the sales team, and they're sort of banging their head against the wall because they keep running into the same profile of person. And they're like, we'll have 10 candidates in the sales pipeline and they all seem to be white women. And they're sitting there looking at me like, Bobby, like, and by the way, they're in the diversity business, right? Like, and what I mean by that is they offer a software that is, that helps with getting anonymous feedback from their from the employee base. So then the company can act upon that feedback, to create a more, inclusive, diverse, I would even say intelligent work experience, for the employees, that maybe have a hard time speaking up or have an issue that, that they just don't want to take direct. And it's just fascinating because I work with a lot of, particularly in tech startup, like I work with, 6, 7 other companies, and over the course of my career, worked with tons more. And the diversity problem usually is really obvious when it's just a bunch of white males. But here I'm sitting with this woman-owned business who, in a lot of ways, it actually represents a very diverse company, because it's predominantly women, and yet they still like feel like this pressure and this tension of not being able to quote unquote get it right. But it's like, but even with the intention, even the space that they're in, they sort of can't hit the mark. So it's surprisingly challenging. It was, I think, on all fronts, for all companies, all individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you throw COVID on top of that, right? So now you're dealing with.
Yeah, you said COVID kind of set us back. What do you mean by that?
Well, in a lot of different ways, COVID set us back. So, when you have fear, uncertainty, like right at the beginning, remember the comments about Asian hate, and that's where the Asian hate started. And then that's going to create fear and uncertainty in everybody else. And that's going to bring bias out, right? So I remember like super early saying, this is going to bring out the good and the evil in people. And it did, right? Because fear and uncertainty is going to bring up the bias, stress. People were under a significant amount of stress financially, personally, in their businesses, that's going to bring out bias. Then you've got people being uprooted from their work environments to now working from home, right? And some people were homeschooling. So now you've got remote working, creating all kinds of new issues and new kinds of issues, right? So like cyberbullying, or rude or, aggressive behaviors on the computer or during video conferences, started to skyrocket. So you were dealing with all different kinds of uncivil behavior that was happening that we hadn't really dealt with at scale this past year and a half, right? And not to mention, because of COVID, now organizations are sitting here, they've got rules, new laws, new regulations about how to keep people safe in their workflows, like who can take the time off, how do they have to, all this stuff where like literally, Bobby, at the beginning of COVID, I made a conscious decision that I was not going to be the expert on COVID law, right? Like, because that would have been my full-time job, right? So they've had a lot of things they've had to deal with in a short period of time. And so forget like peak performance, right? Which should be the focus of most businesses. A lot of them started putting culture on the back burner, right? So now you've got all these issues creating all this bias, all this incivility, and culture is back there somewhere, not even on the agenda item. So that created more incivility, right? So it just started to roll downhill, the civil rights movement, the fact that you've got people of different ages, people are expected to stay at work longer. So now you've got 5 different generations working together. So there's bias issues, multi-generational bias issues popping up. So many things happened because of everything that we've seen this last year and a half, that we are at that point where I really don't think that you can survive as an organization unless you start looking at systemic bias in your organizations and start rooting it out and figuring out how you're going to get rid of it or mitigate it at a very least, right? So.
Yeah, I would take it even further and say you in order to thrive as a business in 2021 and beyond, you really got to think about the work experience that you're providing as an organization. And it's, there's just so much other levels of like competition and sort of equality with regards to product mix, with regards to marketing spend, with regards to everything else. So it's like that advantage really comes into how happy your employees are, how productive they are, how safe they feel, et cetera. Now, you just reminded me of all that stuff. There was so much that sort of went on at that beginning stages of COVID and through on, and like really piled it on there. You're right. Great recap. I think as just like sort of this helpless optimist, I'm just like, well, I think I create my own bias where I turn off the news. I read every motivational, book and newsletter you can imagine. So I may be unplugged from that. Selfishly, I want you to give me some wins. What have you seen from, clients, from organizations, peers that really just like stepped up and they're sort of leading the way, of us starting to focus on culture again and making it a prioritization or priority, I should say.
There are so many. I mean, I'm really seeing a lot of CEOs come front and center, and say, not just say it, but actually put the money behind it. We see it on LinkedIn almost every other day where organizations are, not only using their money to make changes, right, but really putting the resources internally to do the work. I know at least for the clients that I've worked with, they have committed to it. They're dealing with these difficult conversations, and they are difficult conversations. But the ones that understand that these conversations need to happen know that that's the only way to move forward, right? So if you don't talk about bias and unconscious bias and how it impacts every single thing you do, and if people don't understand that in your organization, there's absolutely no way you can survive this, right? Because we're not defined anymore. We're not limited to geographic locations anymore. For Nobody Studios, for example, is the perfect situation, right? I got hired to be on their leadership team, and I hadn't even met anybody there in person, right? We'd only talk on Zoom. So because of all of this stuff that's, I feel like that's been going on, I feel like there's a lot of positive things going on. I look at my connections on LinkedIn that I have on my feed now. I mean, I'm like, where have these people been my whole life? I'm like you, Bobby. I'm in my bubble too. And so I'm in that space. So I know, and that's how we connected as well. But you know what? You have to be intentional. And I tell everybody that, if you don't like people you're seeing on your feed, get rid of them and start liking and following people that are out there talking in the same, whatever energy or frequency you need, and stay there, because there are people that are coming out and they're speaking. We're hearing people share their stories. They're talking about what they've gone through. They're sharing their pain. And the more that people do that, then you start to see that, wait a second, I had a similar pain. Yeah, it didn't look like yours. Of course, it's never going to look like anybody else's, but it still felt the same. And so the more that we recognize, like that was such when I shared my story, for example, on the TedX talk of what I'd gone through, I had so many people reach out to me afterwards and say, I was bullied when I was in school, or my parents were immigrants from India and I went through the same thing. Or even if they weren't from India, just I was a girl and I was bullied, and so when you start hearing that, all of a sudden that feeling that you have that you're all alone in this pain starts to be distributed. It's like, I'm not the only one. Wait, other people have felt this way. And you start feeling that interconnectedness, which I really think that we're losing in a lot of ways. Like in certain ways we're losing it, and other ways we're being more intentional about it. And so, I don't know, I'm like you. I'm going to stay in my bubble for a while, because there's a lot of stuff going on out there that I'm like, oh my God, when is this going to end? Yeah. For real.
Right on. Well, I want to hear a little bit more about your story. I mean, we when we first connected, I watched the TED Talk. I'm familiar with some of the stuff you went through. My listeners are not. We've heard a bunch about the work that you do, and how that work's been challenged by the pandemic. Let's hear a little bit more about your story.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier, my parents are from India. I grew up in a predominantly Italian neighborhood, right? We were the only Indian family there. And so I dealt with harassment and bullying very early on. And I think it's early. I remember it starting around like fourth grade, right? That's as far back as I can go, but it continued all the way up through high school. Right. And so that was me, sort of being on the sort of receiving end of bias. Right. And these were kids bullying me. And so, kids can be cruel, but they're also a product of their own environment. I'm not justifying what they did to me. Obviously, you shouldn't treat anybody that way, right? So I'm not making any excuses for it. But what I'm saying is that I get it. If they were raised to look at me and we did look different, we were different a certain way, then that's how they responded, right? And so that really was sort of, I knew from an early age that those experiences, I wanted to be a social justice advocate. I wanted to go to law school. I wanted to do something so that other people won't have to go through sort of what I went through. And so I went to law school as planned. I graduated. And then after I graduated, I became a defense attorney. And so now I went from being the victim of bias to now I was actually representing leaders who were accused of harassing or discriminating. So I was on the other side and really got to see the other side of harassment, discrimination, and really affect change at the source, right? So I got to see on both sides.
Real quick, do you think that was intentional, or was that sort of like it just sort of happenstance? You sort of ended up on that other side?
No, it just kind of happened in that way. It happened in that way. I did not plan for me to be a defense attorney. I actually wasn't even sure I wanted to do employment law when I was in law school, right? It just sort of fell into my lap. And I was like, first I started doing workers' compensation and I was like, this is definitely not what I want to do. And then I started getting these cases where an employee had filed a workers' compensation claim. And then they were now filing another claim saying they were being retaliated against for filing that workers' compensation claim. That started to pique my interest. And now I was like, okay, let me see what this is all about. And so that's kind of led me into going into employment law. But I did not plan on being a defense attorney. And it was really a very important part of my journey because that's where I really started to understand bias, really had to understand my own bias and do my work so that I can be a neutral, be good at my work that I was doing, and not let my own personal beliefs or biases impact my work. So really kind of doing the work myself and putting into place strategies to help me deal with my own bias was something that I started telling other people and and then when I started doing training after my son was born, right away I was drawn into that area and I'm like, okay, we need to really educate people on this topic. And that's kind of what led me to starting my own company in 2017. It's a lot.
Yeah, it's like, isn't it? Well, thank you for sharing the story. And just fascinating. I think two things just jump out at me. I mean, one, that just irony of you ending up on the other side and that sort of dovetailing into your fascination with the awareness of all sides, right? The awareness of just what is, the observations, minus the judgment, right? And that's like, even when you're explaining the bullying, like you did such a good, careful job of saying like, I'm not justifying these kids' behavior. I'm recognizing the reality. And that is the beautiful thing I like to call nuance that I don't think exists enough today, is that recognition of the nuance of situations. And what was it like to just start sort of like really following that path 4 years ago, saying like, this is like, it's almost academic. Like that's kind of how I am with intention. Like I sometimes I pinch myself. I'm like, why am I so interested in this stuff? I don't really know. Was that sort of how you felt in 2017, that you just were like, I'm going down this rabbit hole and I don't really know why?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly it. It wasn't that I don't know why. It was more that I was like, we can make a bigger impact in civility and diversity and inclusion if people just understood this. So I already knew that I was wanting to, do diversity inclusion training work. That was something that was I already been doing that pretty much my whole life. And even as an attorney, just educating people along the way. So that I knew, but being able to focus on bias and really kind of fine tuning my skills in that area was just because I was like, this is where we need to do the work, the most work. Like I said, this unconscious bias piece, and it all started with when I would do the training and just even the word by itself, I would say the word and I would see people disconnect from the conversation. And I'm like, wait a second, like I'm telling you something that you need to understand about yourself, and you're not connecting to this conversation because you think that bias is this bad thing. Well, it's only bad when you don't know about it, right? When you're not aware of it and it's controlling your behaviors. So I started replacing that word bias with belief. And I started seeing such a huge difference in my trainings, where people were like, oh, I learned so much. I didn't realize neuroscience has come such a long way. And I'm not a scientist, like a doctor. I'm not even saying that I am, right? But it's come a long way in the last decade that anybody can just learn and read this stuff and say, oh my God, wow, I need to understand this stuff. There's a lot that we can do, especially that we can retrain our minds, that we don't have to be victims of our bias. We don't have to just, continue being harmed by it if we know how to interrupt it, if we empower people like bystanders to help them understand what they do in those situations, right? Which is so, I started seeing where the gaps were and what we were doing and what we weren't. And I honed in on those areas, right? So what I'm doing is not the only solution to this problem, right? There's lots of different solutions. And I am very careful about my words because I don't want anybody to think that I'm giving anybody a hall pass for their behavior and saying that, you get away with this, or that there's, just be nice to people and that we're not going to have a problem anymore. That's not what we're saying. I'm saying that let's do it in the right way. Let's motivate people in a positive and an uplifting way so they get motivated for long-term results, right? We can't just fear people into, you got to go through this and you got to do it. That's not going to work. It might work temporarily, but it's not going to lead to long-term results. So we have to be careful with our words, and we have to be all inclusive. Everybody has to be invited to this party. There's nobody that's not, we're not excluding anybody because we all need to do this work on ourselves. Yes. And, good on you for recognizing that it's not the only solution. It's fascinating to me because I'm like, I think the other part that's sort of circling the wagons here, that's sort of bumping right up against like workplace bias or lack of diversity is kind of mindset and the advantages that we're starting to see of mindset and being able to, better enjoy life, right? Like these things sort of intersect and complement one another. And I don't know if we always make that connection, right? Like you talked very beginning of the show about the sort of zero sum mentality. Well, that impacts all kinds of things not related to, diversity, inclusivity, right? Like that impacts your perspective of how you can get employed. It impacts your perspective of like, your happiness and just how you interact with the world. So there's, for all the things that I think are definitely challenged and we have plenty, there's also these sort of complementary forces, narratives, philosophies, ideas that are sort of working in limbo, I think, to fight the good fight alongside you and your work. Absolutely. And I'll just give you one example, right? So they've identified over 180 different kinds of unconscious bias, right? So they all deal with different things. 180. So if you think about that, like you'd have to go through all 180 to see, do I have these tendencies or not? And it is scary. Like when you can take the implicit.
That's a little intimidating.
It is, but it's good because it's not a pass or fail, right? It's not like for example, the implicit association test is one tool that you can take. It's online. You can take it, and it gives you an idea of which way do you lean? Do you have a preference in one way or the other? And we always have a preference. When we're given two options, we're going to lean in one direction, right? And so, but it tells you that. So it's not like, oh, wow, you leaned in this direction 50 times, so you're a bad person. It's information that's valuable information for you to know about yourself, because that's your natural tendency. But now that you know that, guess what? The good news is now you can put strategies into place to mitigate those, right? So they don't all deal with the same kinds of issues. They're all unique and different to us. But if you don't do the work, if you don't even take the first step of saying that I have these, that's where I saw the disconnect. And I'm like, no, we got to find a way around this, because people are not even taking that step to do this work because they're afraid they're going to be labeled or stigmatized or called something or another, right? And it's not about judgment. It's not about shaming anybody. It literally is just you understanding yourself better and how you think and what your beliefs are, so that you can make sure you're not unintentionally harming somebody. If you're intentionally harming somebody, that person doesn't get a pass. That person still needs to be dealt with, right? So, but I have to make it clear, because I think a lot of people are out there saying that, oh, unconscious bias is not the solution. And I'm like, that's not the only solution. That's a part of the solution, a big part of the solution, in my opinion, right? And that's where I've decided to focus here, because I've seen how harmful it can be. Because if we don't address it, again, it turns into a lawsuit. You know, the behavior continues and continues. Nobody lets the person know that they're harming somebody. And pretty soon, anybody in that situation is going to feel like this person is discriminating against me. And it must be because of X, Y, and Z. Right? So you need to be proactive and deal with it head on, right?
Well, I think that's exactly right. It's just proactive versus reactive. And, we're not proactive enough on really everything. So something like this, it's, I think that the work is not only necessary, it's drastically more impactful if you can get ahead of it.
Yeah. And we're not proactive. Why? Because we're on this like mad race to get like on the train to nowhere, right? Like it's like go, go, go. And you're like, how do I have time to be proactive? How do I have time to take a look at my processes and my systems to see if they're actually doing what they're supposed to do, or they're filled with bias and they're harming people, right? But we don't even have time to slow down and do that. This last year and a half gave us that time. It really slowed us down to say, wait a second. We need to take a look at this stuff. And especially when everything is changing. This is the perfect time. Let's get in there. And for the places that aren't doing that, they're not going to last. They're just not going to last. Period.
That's right. That's right. Well, let's finish up with talking about your story a little bit more. I want to know two things. I want to know, you've been you started your business almost 4 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like what surprised you along the way? And then I want to get into Nobody Studios and, it's sort of your latest venture and how that's going. And, let's finish talking about those two things.
Yeah. So I started my business in 2017. I was already doing a lot of training before that for other people. I was consulting and things. And then I had a birthday in November and I said, I'm going to go for it. Like, I'm just going to go for this. And honestly, I was doing the same training that I'm doing now. I called myself Chief Civility Officer there. I knew what I wanted to do. It just became even more relevant, right? It was already relevant, became even more relevant. But I'll tell you, my biggest discovery as far as my Train Extra work goes was when COVID happened. Because prior to COVID, I was doing, and I think I mentioned this to you on the phone when we spoke the first time, is I was doing all my trainings in person. So I was flying all over in person, doing these workshops and these trainings. And I love that. I love being in front of a crowd and really work in the room and getting everybody to pay attention and really grasp this information. And so when COVID happened, I had to really make a tough decision on, am I going to continue doing this? Because if you know me at all, you know that I do this for impact, right? So I was like, I don't know, am I going to have the same impact on people on the computer? I wasn't set up for it. I never even used PowerPoint before, right? So I was all storytelling. So I had to change everything around, and I did. And I'm very happy I did, because I love doing virtual trainings too. and it's grown on me over time. I think, in the long run, I'd probably like to have like a healthy balance of both, because I do like both. But yeah, it really was hard. This last year was a struggle for me, about just making that decision. Obviously financially it took a major hit. But what I've learned is that I've made the right decision, and I love what I do, and I'm going to keep doing it for as long as I can. I just told my cousins visited from Chicago this past weekend, and I said, we were talking about, what do you want to do after you retire? And I said, I'm still going to continue doing my train extra work, like 2 or 3 days a week, because I actually really enjoy it. Right. So this is the perfect job that I can see myself doing for as long as I want to, and it not take away too much from the other things I might want to do too.
That's great. That's great. And has the changes been as simple as, instead of being in person storytelling, you're on Zoom and maybe sharing some screen sharing, basically? Is there sharing some slide decks? Is there any other interesting, maybe progressive solutions?
No. It's totally different, because I had to create PowerPoint decks for all of mine. I had to learn Zoom. I had never even really used it. Maybe I think I used it one time prior. So, I try to make them very interactive now, because if I'm live, I'm asking a question, they're raising their hands, they're answering questions. So incorporating that into the presentations virtually, about how do I make everybody feel included, keep them all engaged, really had tapped into, I had to get super creative with how I was going to deliver it and everything. It took me about 5 months last year before I was fully ready to go. Luckily, I had a couple of clients that had their own training businesses, and so they were already doing training virtually. So they pulled me in as one of their facilitators. So that kind of gave me some time to get my own stuff going. But yeah, I like to just keep it very basic on what I do. It's, again, lots of storytelling. I really want to provide people with information to really empower them. That's my goal, is that they walk out of there with some things that they need to work on themselves, or they could work on, to start learning about their biases or what they can do to contribute to a better work environment. And so if I can empower people and they realize that they are a part of that solution, I've done my job, right? So.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I think just to wrap, I want to hear a little bit about how it's going with Nobody Studios. We talk about a lot on this show, how once we start going down a path and we really are consistent with it, the universe sort of shows up in interesting ways. And I know Nobody Studios, I think was interesting in a couple of ways. One, right before we talked, we found out that they're just south of me in Laguna. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And B, I think more importantly, is just the fact that early on, a venture studio looking to spin out a large list of organizations in a short amount of time, has decided, that culture is going to be a big part of it, and bringing you on board sooner rather than later. I think that sums it up well, right?
Totally. No, that sums it up perfectly. And the only thing I need to add to that is, and they know what I'm out there advocating for. So it's like, you know what I mean? Like, if you're going to bring me in, that you got to do this. So you've got to do this the right way, right? So
there's some accountability there.
Exactly. I'm going to be challenging them. I'm hoping that that is the reason why they brought me in there. But no, it is. I'm actually very humbled by this opportunity, because I know how important culture is to our CEO, who's Mark McNally. And by the way, I still need to introduce the two of you. I'm sure you'll have an amazing conversation. I told you that when we spoke on the phone. But it's a really exciting role for me, because it really brings everything I've done in my career as an attorney, as an investigator, as a trainer, as a facilitator, as a public speaker. It kind of brings all that to, now I get to actually get my hands in there and help create the strategy for the solutions that I'm out there talking about. So I'm super excited about it. It's not like I know all the answers. I don't. I'm learning just like everybody else. But I'm motivated to do this right. I'm surrounded by an amazing, epic leadership team that, is there supporting me. And like I said, it is a big deal for them to bring a startup at this young age to make this a priority and put it on the forefront. So super huge. I can't wait to see what happens. It's really exciting.
Yeah, no, I'm excited for you. And it's a cool story. I think you sort of bumped into Mark on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
You're doing your work, you're doing your stuff, and people take notice.
He did. Yeah. He came to me and we joke around. I go, yeah, he was kind of like stalking my LinkedIn profile for a while and then said, I like what she's doing. I want to bring her in. So the way I got into the studio was because, obviously I care about workplace culture. And one of the companies I'm a co-founder on now is, we call it Wellbridge internally, but it's going to be basically a company that deals with creating a solution for crisis intervention at work. And so that's the reason why he said, do you want to join the studio? And then after I joined, he was like, hey, we would really love to have you sort of head up the culture piece. So again, super grateful because I know how important it is for them. And of course it's important for me. So I'm just, I'm happy that I'm also very connected to a lot of great people that are doing some amazing work in here that are, mentors to me that I can learn from as well as I kind of, work with our leadership team on these issues too.
Well, I think it's time I let you go take care of your son there, Sejal. I really appreciate you joining us here on the show and sharing a little bit about your story and the work that you do. You've got a tall order, I think, both from just the kind of work that you do, as well as the organization you're now partnering with in Nobody Studios. You've got a lot of work ahead of you, but you sound like you're enthusiastic and ready to get it all done.
Thank you. Thank you again for inviting me, and I look forward to us doing it again soon.
Hey, it's Bobby. Thanks for listening to today's show. For more, follow Student of Intention at www.studentofintention.com. And remember, don't wait, start small, learn as you go.